Hi, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. So, welcome to our session to talk about good data governance practice updates. There are three presenters in this session that I would like to introduce to you. Is myself, Shila Rastegar. I'm a senior compliance specialist with Regulatory Operation and Enforcement Branch at Health Canada. The second presenter is here, Dr. Cheryl Grandinetti. She is a clinical pharmacologist from the Good Clinical Practice Assessment Branch, a senior reviewer with US FDA. And the third presenter here is Andrew Fisher, and he is the lead senior GCP inspector with MHRA. And all the bios are also available. Throughout this session, the presenters will discuss the risk proportionate approach to data governance. We will talk about importance of good data governance practices. We'll provide you with some updates to E6R3 guideline related to data governance, including the investigator and sponsor responsibilities. And we will conclude with providing you with some deficiency examples and case studies to highlight the importance of these recommendations related to data governance. Now I hand it over to Cheryl to cover her presentation.
Thank you, Sheila. Okay, first things first, this is my FDA disclaimer slide. So today I plan to discuss the risk proportionate approach to data governance, what we mean by this, and how this approach should be applied throughout the data lifecycle. And then later on in the presentation, I will provide a case example at the end. So as we heard this morning, the ICH E6 GCP guideline is currently undergoing its third revision. And I'd like to highlight an important change to this guideline that we've already talked about today. And that is the use of risk proportionate approaches throughout the clinical trial lifecycle. I think it's important for us to understand that this risk proportionality provides the flexibilities when applying the GCP guideline to the design and conduct of the clinical trial. And since this is a major theme in our session today, before we get started, let's just take a moment and talk a little more about how this risk proportionality concept is presented in E6R3. So the draft E6R3 guideline builds on concepts in ICH E8R1, which is another ICH guideline that describes accepted principles and practices for clinical trial design and conduct. And E8R1 introduces and discusses in some detail the concept of building quality into the design of your trial. E6R3 highlights the importance of quality by design and fostering a quality culture, so one that values and rewards critical thinking and where leadership promotes open reporting, encourages investigation, and supports proportionate management of critical errors. The quality by design approach involves identifying factors that are critical to the study's quality, identifying risks to the critical to quality factors, and then using a risk proportionate approach to managing these risks. And this process is done during the design and planning of your study and should be revisited throughout the study conduct, analysis, and reporting. The E6R3 guideline emphasizes that processes and risk management strategies used in the trial should be proportionate to the importance of the trial data and the risk to trial participants' safety and data reliability. So as we start to talk more specifically in this session about the E6R3 data governance updates, I urge you to keep two principles foremost in your mind. The first is this overarching foundational principle that clinical trial quality is considered as fitness for purpose, meaning that the quality and amount of information generated from the clinical trial should be sufficient to support good decision-making. The second concept is the concept of risk proportionality, which I've just mentioned. And taking a risk proportionate approach throughout the clinical trial lifecycle is an important operational approach to achieving the goal of fit for purpose clinical trial quality. This risk proportionate approach extends to data governance activities and would include the sponsor targeting and focusing efforts on those data governance activities that are critical to the quality of your study. So what does taking a risk proportionate approach to data governance activities look like? Well, this approach starts with quality by design, and it takes planning, coordination, and cooperation. So specifically, first, during the design and planning of your study, you should prospectively identify which data, which computerized systems, and data governance processes are critical to data integrity and clinical trial quality. So we're talking about the data and the processes, if inaccurate, not performed, or performed incorrectly, would threaten the protection and safety of trial participants or the integrity of the study results. And this would be dependent on your study and study design, so there is no one size fits all. Secondly, again, during the design and planning phase of the study, and even throughout the study conduct, you should ensure input from all trial personnel, including your data scientists and your key data governance service providers, to help identify the critical data and the critical to quality systems and processes and risk to those systems, processes, and to the data. You should also ensure input when you're developing and implementing your risk mitigation strategies. Third, focus resources and monitoring on the identified critical data, systems, and processes to ensure the reliability of the data throughout the data lifecycle. Fourth, ensure there's a shared understanding by all trial personnel of what is critical to quality, so communication is key. Fifth, review and evaluate risk to the critical to quality factors throughout the trial and update your risk assessments as necessary. So for example, when there are key changes made to the protocol and other plans and trial processes. Again, involve your data scientists in this process. And then finally, you should document your risk assessments and your implemented risk mitigation strategies. So section 4.2 of ICH E6R3 is on the data lifecycle, and it includes new and expanded text on data capture, review of data and metadata, data corrections, data transfers, and finalization of data sets prior to analysis. You'll hear more about these and the data lifecycle throughout this session. But to quickly summarize, the risk proportionate approach to data governance should be used and applied throughout the data lifecycle with a focus on critical data and the systems and processes that help ensure data quality. And so with that introduction, I'm going to pass the baton back to Shila, where she'll introduce some key data governance processes, which will be the basis of many of our case examples today.
Thank you, Cheryl, for the great introduction on requirement for implementation of risk proportionate approach throughout the clinical trial lifecycle. The focus of my presentation will be on data governance in management of computerized systems. And as part of the presentation, I will talk about importance of good data governance practices. The new section in ICH E6R3. I will introduce the 4 key processes for the full data lifecycle. I will talk about responsibilities of sponsor and investigators related to data and record and management of computerized systems. I will talk about requirements for validation of computerized system and conclude by providing examples of validation deficiencies observed in computerized systems. Data governance framework is a set of policies, guidelines, and processes that enable effective management of the data. And there's a great emphasis on quality in the new guideline. So it should be taken into consideration that quality should be designed in the clinical trial using risk proportionate approach. The quality and the amount of the information generated throughout the study should be sufficient to provide reliable results and to protect the safety of the participants in the study. So two key elements that we are focusing on through this session are quality in the design and conduct of the study, and also risk management and risk mitigations. Data governance provides guidance on appropriate management of data integrity, being completeness, accuracy, reliability. It provides guidance on traceability and security of the data. These are all critical factors for data quality that would allow accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification of the trial results. It also provides guidance on handling of the data and record keeping, how to obtain reliable results. It also, the risk proportionate approach applies to data governance activities. So we should implement risk proportionate processes and fit for purpose system controls. It provides requirements on relevant metadata and audit trails to be in place, and how to have structured data transfer and migration approaches. This section should be read in conjunction with ICH E8 and E9. There should be consideration for quality in the design and conduct of the study, as Shila stated, with identifying the critical factors to the quality and manage the risk for those factors. The systems and processes should be designed and implemented in a way that's proportionate to the risk to participants and reliability of the study data. The new section, data governance section of R3, introduces the following 4 processes for full data lifecycle with emphasis on criticality of the data, and they should be implemented proportionately and documented appropriately. So the process number 1 is to ensure data protection of participants' confidential data. Process number 2, to ensure computerized systems are fit for purpose and used appropriately. Third system, to safeguard essential elements of the trial, such as randomization, dose escalation, and blinding. And the fourth system, to support key decision-making, such as data finalization prior to analysis, unblinding, allocation to analysis data sets, and changes in clinical trial design. The 3 presenters in this session will expand on these 4 key processes and provide example of deficiencies and case studies relevant to these processes. Andrew will cover process number 1 and number 4. I will talk on process number 2, and Cheryl will expand and talk about process number 3. So the focus of my presentation from now on is on the second process, to ensure computerized systems are fit for purpose and used appropriately. So what are some of the investigator responsibilities in terms of records that's identified in the new guideline R3? In generating, reporting, recording data, the investigators should ensure integrity of the data. The investigator should ensure that data systems deployed by the sponsor are used as specified per instructions. And also the investigator should ensure the accuracy, completeness, legibility, and timeliness of the data reported to the sponsor in data systems. What are some of the responsibilities of the sponsor in regards to data and records? Sponsors in general are responsible to ensure requirements of the computerized systems are addressed and implemented in a risk proportionate manner. They should ensure integrity and confidentiality of the data. They should apply quality control to all relevant stages of data handling to ensure that the quality is in place and the data is of sufficient quality to provide reliable results and to protect safety of the participants in the study. They should ensure that data collection tools are fit for purpose and are validated. and should ensure documented processes are implemented to ensure the data integrity for the full data lifecycle. When using computerized system, there are more specific requirements for the sponsors. They require to have a record of the computerized system. This includes the use, functionality, interface, and validation. They ensure requirements for the systems deployed, such as the requirements for validation, for audit trail, for IT security, backup, disaster recovery, user access management. All of those requirements are implemented with documented procedure and adequate training. They need to assess and document whether systems deployed by the investigators are also fit for purpose, and ensure that there's a process in place for investigators and service providers to be able to report to the sponsor if there are any defects with any of the systems being used. Risk proportionality applies to computerized system as well, to ensure that the computerized systems are designed and implemented to the criticality of the data, to ensure protection of the safety of the participants participating in the study. As such, the sponsor is responsible to ensure expectations of the systems are addressed in a risk proportionate manner. The sponsor should review whether the systems used by the investigators and institutions are fit for purpose and conforms to the established requirements for completeness, accuracy, and reliability. And the responsible party should ensure those developing computerized systems are aware of the intended use and regulatory requirements. So to apply the necessary efforts in the design of those computerized systems to comply with these requirements. Data governance establishes policies and procedures, while data management uses those policies and procedures to create and compile good quality data. There are 4 principles to data management as listed here: to collect the right data with the right tools, to collect complete and accurate data to support data integrity, to apply appropriate controls, and to be able to produce sufficient information and to provide a complete clinical study report. I will focus on the 3rd aspect of the principle for applying appropriate controls to expand on. In applying appropriate controls, it should be taken into consideration to have adequate procedures and personnel training, to have control on data flow, being data transfer, data import, data interfaces, and more importantly, to have system controls. As part of the system controls, it's security of the system, it's access control, it's validation. These are the 3 important aspects of system controls, and also to have quality control of the data and perform data validation activities. I will take the validation aspect now of the controlled system controls. There are 3 principles for the validation: to have appropriate controls of the systems to be in place. Documentation exists to support the application of those controls, and the systems is fit for purpose. As with any recommendation in the R3 being heavily focused on risk proportionate approach, the approach to validation of computerized system are also based on risk assessment, taking into consideration the intended use of the system, the purpose and importance of the data being generated, processed, maintained, and retained in the system, and the potential of the system to affect the safety, well-being, right, and participants, or the integrity and reliability of the results. Validation should demonstrate that the system conforms to the established requirements for completeness, accuracy, and reliability, and the system can perform in a consistent manner. I also would like to bring to your attention that validation should be maintained throughout the life cycle of the system. As with any data system, there's a potential for having some system failures. There should be processes established and be in place to mitigate the risk. There should be contingency procedures in place to prevent loss or lack of accessibility. There should be mechanisms such as help desk support in place to document, evaluate, and manage issues, and to have continuous risk assessment throughout the study. And also defects and issues should be resolved based on criticality related to the timelines. So issues of higher risk should be addressed more timely. Now I'm going to walk you through some example of validation deficiencies observed during the inspections. The first example, there was the database use was not adequately validated for the intended use. The ECRF was not designed or validated to collect per protocol the primary efficacy endpoint of the data, which is a very critical data point in the study. And the impact of this caused for the data collected to not contain all the data variables needed to properly assess and analyze the primary endpoint of the study, as at the end we had incomplete data. On the right-hand side, I quoted some of the requirements as stated in E6 R3 to link the recommendations of R3 to the issues and deficiencies identified. As you can see on your right-hand side, it says the approach to validation should be based on a risk assessment, consider intended use, and also validation should demonstrate that the system conforms for completeness, accuracy, information, which in this case we did not have complete data. The second example, there was lack of adequate documentation for system design, testing, and change control procedures. So as a result of that, we did not have adequate information, and we had incomplete evidence of validation. And again, the link to requirements of R3, as you see on the right-hand side, are very clearly speaking to those deficiencies. So that's why I just wanted to bring to your attention the importance of following the recommendation of the R3. Another example, the system test script execution record did not include testing of all the requirements. There was a critical functionality testing for randomization in the IRT system that testing was not performed, which resulted in participants to be randomized incorrectly. And again, there are requirements for testing of all the requirements, especially the critical functionality, which in this case was the randomization, which was not done. There were issues identified with the design and control. There were some missing adverse event pages for the corresponding SAE pages. As such, the information on the SAE pages captured were incomplete, and it did not have all the information without having the corresponding adverse event page for assessing SAEs. And the impact was data quality for safety assessment. And again, the requirements are on the right-hand side, linking to the deficiency. The last example, audit trails were not complete, as there were no audit trail for deletions. And that's, again, something that was not done completely. And the requirement on the right-hand side says that systems should be designed to permit data changes in a way that initial data entry, any subsequent changes, or deletions to be documented. And this was a data integrity issue. As Cheryl stated, when you're using a quality by design approach, you are designing quality into your study and identifying the critical factors that impacts the quality. to potentially have an impact to participants' safety or reliability of the data, and you need to manage the risk to those critical to quality factors with a risk proportionate approach. So to summarize, what were some of the critical to quality factors in the example of validation deficiencies we observed? One was to design per intended use and according to the protocol. Data integrity principles should apply during the system design, taking into consideration the criticality and importance of the data being generated, maintained, and retained in the data system. System should conform to the established requirements for completeness, accuracy, reliability, and functionality testing to be performed in general, and in particular, critical functionality testing to be performed, which, if you recall, in the example I provided, that randomization was a critical functionality testing that was not done. And lastly, to have documented procedures in place from beginning to the end for study design, validation, functionality testing, setup, installation, change control, all the way to decommissioning of the system. Now I pass it to Andrew Fisher to cover his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to address the first, number one, which is relation to participants' confidential information protection, with an example. But first, let's see what ICH E6R3 says about protection of such information. It does define confidentiality in terms of prevention of sharing of information with unauthorized individuals, and it's clear that participants should be told during the informed consent process that any confidential information on trial records will be kept confidential, both in the discussion and in any of the trial materials used. And it's therefore a requirement for the sponsor to ensure that this confidentiality is maintained and implement appropriate measures to protect this information from unauthorized access. Participants' confidentiality is a right, one of their rights, and therefore any factors in the trial design that could impact on these rights, resulting in a breach, needs to be part of the risk assessment, and then controls need to be put in place to mitigate the risk. The controls needed need to be proportionate, and that depends on the nature and the extent of the confidential information that is being assessed. It's also important that computerized systems that are used for any confidential information are also considered in this assessment to make sure there's no risk of unauthorized access and a breach of the participants' rights. So the example that I'm going to talk about is from an MHRA routine GCP surveillance systems inspection of a CRO, and the trial was selected as an example trial to be reviewed for GCP compliance, so there was no trigger in relation to confidential information management. So during the inspection, the inspectors discovered serious breach of participants' rights to confidentiality, which resulted in a critical finding. So this comprised of confidential data were contained in the CRF, and obviously its audit trail, and were accessible to all members of staff of the sponsor and the CRO who had view rights in the ECRF. The data was stored outside of the UK, EU, actually in the USA. The participants hadn't given their consent for these data to be shared with the sponsor or the CRO or transferred out of the UK. And they were told that their data would be pseudo-anonymized. And there was no protocol or other document that was provided to the MHRA or to the Research Ethics Committee that stated these data would be captured in the ECRF and available to the sponsor in this manner. So you're all thinking, well, what data are we talking about? Well, the trial was a decentralized trial, and the first visit was an on-site visit, and then remote follow-up was undertaken of the participants And that was done by accessing the NHS hospital episode statistics, which is a national system. So they could look at that and identify any hospitalizations of the participants, which was part of the endpoint of the trial. In order to do this, they needed the patient's date of birth and their unique NHS number to link the data together so they could pull the right data out of the NHS systems. Additionally, the analysis in the trial wanted to consider the background social deprivation index of each participant. And in the UK, the SDI requires specifying at the street level, and a full postcode for each participant's home address was therefore required. In the UK, this would narrow down the location of a participant's home address to potentially just a very small handful of addresses. So whilst there may be valid reasons for having this data for the trial design, the issue was that it hadn't been fully considered. So what did go wrong? Well, the CRO did their own assessment, and they decided that they didn't understand that the data was going to be in the CRF. All the protocol and the consent materials didn't talk about the data that they were collecting. So during the protocol review and the review of the information sheet, it wasn't picked up in the approval processes. The risk assessment for the computerized system didn't require any consideration of risk to participant confidentiality in terms of the data collected, consent and access controls. And this was an unusual situation for the CRO. It's not very often that you see this type of data being collected in clinical trials. They're usually anonymized. And so there was no procedures in the organization to address how to manage such data at all. So what critical to quality factors could have prevented a breach of the participants' confidentiality and could have been assessed? Well, they could have seen the need for this data in the trial design and thought about it as part of the risk assessment. They could have thought about the best way to use a computerized system to manage this data. So is the ECRF that everybody's got access to the best place to put this? They may have thought of a separate dedicated database instead. They could have thought about where to keep the data and who needed access to it, when and why. So if it was to do with the analysis, perhaps the statistician only needed access to that particular information in order to do that analysis, and not everybody in both organizations. They could have looked at the consenting process to make sure that patients were properly informed of what data was going where in relation to the trial design. So what corrective actions did the CROs make? Well, they changed the storage location of the data, and they also liaised with the Research Ethics Committee to confirm the actions required in regards to communicating with the patients regarding the breach. They also looked to see if there were any other trials that this could have happened, to see whether it was a systemic issue, which it wasn't. They changed the access rights to the specific data in the ECRF. And I put a note there that a new point in ICH E6R3 does cover making sure that access rights are appropriate. And they also removed the confidential information from the audit trail by running a script. And again, this is an example of an exceptional circumstance where you might need to modify an audit trail, which is contained in the public consultation E6R3. In terms of preventative actions, the CRO needed to update its procedural controls in relation to the management of confidential information. So this included revisions made in its quality management system in terms of risk assessment and management processes in relation to the need for such information as part of protocol development, and informed consent materials production, and the data lifecycle in terms of relation to confidential data. And of course, making sure that everybody is trained in all these procedures as well. So in summary, the CRO failed to have an appropriate risk assessment of the trial design in relation to confidential information. So the trial participants weren't told what such confidential data would be collected, and why and where the data would be stored. And the computerized system was built with no mitigations to the risks of having such data contained in it, and appropriate access controls to the data weren't in place. So a risk-based quality by design approach advocated by ICH E6R3 to include the risk to participants' rights to confidentiality in trial design in trials that needed this data would have prevented this. So the next process in full data lifecycle, I'll look at an element of number 4, and this is in relation to data finalization for decision making. ICH E6R3 suggests that sponsors should define what the quality of the data needs to be in order to give reliable analysis results and then the decisions made upon them. So, for example, does every single data point need to be checked and queries raised and resolved? Is there some data that you can tolerate a level of error or variability in without actually impacting the overall results of the trial? Which data needs to be used in which specific analysis? So for an interim analysis, it's just part of the data compared to the final analysis. So defining the data you need for an analysis and the quality of it. And then the processes and procedures that are set out on this slide in relation to data management can then be used in the appropriate way on that critical data to meet the defined quality. And these can then be adjusted depending on what the data is used for. For example, a DSMB may be quite okay with just reviewing accumulating AE data, which may contain both monitored and unmonitored data, so QC'd and non-QC data. But then if the DSMB is deciding on the next dose to escalate to a higher dose, in that case, they might want to make sure that the quality of data is really high and fully QC'd and monitored. So what the purpose of the data is for also relates back to its quality. And then how can it be assessed that the processes you decided to use have actually been followed? So what essential records are going to be maintained so that you can see that the processes have been followed and that the data is fit for purpose? So is there some sort of summary checklist prior to finalization of the data that shows all the activities that have been done? And then can you drill down into the nitty-gritty of all the reports and records and listing QC records to actually see these activities being done in detail? And then, of course, the access to the data collection tools may need changing depending on the purpose of the analysis. So for an interim analysis, you could just take a snapshot with no changes to edit access, or there may be a requirement to do some partial restrictions or freezing, or the database needs to be completely locked. So how the access changes depends on the nature of the analysis. So here's an example from a trial-specific GCP inspection that had regulatory decisions made both on interim analyses and final analyses submitted to the MHRA. So the data that was going to be used and prepared for the interim analysis were defined in just a PowerPoint slide that said what the CRF screens needed cleaning. There was nothing in there about the laboratory data, which formed a key part of the efficacy data, and that hadn't been adequately addressed. There was nothing in any data validation plan or an SOP concerning the data finalization, and the SOP didn't actually address interim analyses at all. It was just focused on final analysis. The SOP did require a final data finalization worksheet to be completed for the final analysis, but because the SOP didn't apply to the interim analysis, there wasn't one done, so we couldn't see what activities had been done for the interim analysis data. There was a bit of a more detailed plan for the final analysis of all the event-positive patients, and the data finalization worksheet was completed, but it said there were unresolvable queries outstanding, and this was actually contrary to the plan, which said there would be no pending queries, so it appeared they hadn't actually followed the plan that they'd written down. And when we looked deeper into the spreadsheet tracking data, we found that there were 700 queries that were documented as unresolvable, but there was no sponsor review to consider the impact of these unresolved queries, and some of them concerned adverse event data, laboratory results, and also eligibility of the trial participants. So this raised concerns that the quality of the submitted data was questionable, and so the sponsor then had to take an impact assessment and looking at all the unresolved queries to see if there was any changes to the data that had been submitted to us to make our decision. In this case, fortunately, there wasn't any impact, but there was obviously a lot of work that had to be done at this point of the process, which was could have been avoided. So what factors could they have looked at in terms of critical to quality to help them prevent this? Well, they could have looked at what processes there are in place to identify the critical data for the safety and efficacy analyses. They could have looked at how the critical data that they've identified would be managed and processed and declared fit for purpose. They could have assessed what documentation would be generated to confirm that the defined processes actually had been followed, and then whether the critical data of sufficient quality would provide reliable results. So in summary then, the organisation had an inconsistent approach to interim and final data analysis preparation of the data, despite them both being used for regulatory submissions and regulatory decision making. So they were doing different things just because one was interim and one was final, and you couldn't reconstruct what had happened at the interim compared to the final in the same way. And although they'd had a documented process for the final analysis data cleaning, by not documenting all that they'd resolved, not resolving all the data queries, they hadn't followed their own process for that. And thankfully that the queries didn't have no impact, but there's no documented review by the sponsor that they didn't have any impact. So overall, the new text in ICH E6R3 for risk-based data governance would ensure a focus on ensuring that the required quality of the critical data had been defined, and then also that the processes used to actually assure this were actually appropriately documented and demonstrate that that quality had actually been met. So that's my example. So now I hand back to Cheryl for another example and then to wrap it up. Thanks very much.
So thank you, Andy. The final key process that we'll talk about today is safeguarding key clinical trial design elements. And I'll present a case that focuses specifically on the key process of safeguarding the blind. So the data governance section in E6R3 recommends that your trial's risk assessment include the potential for planned and unplanned unblinding, that computerized systems and processes be designed and implemented in a way that protects the blind across all appropriate stages of the trial. This includes managing user accounts and roles for providing data access, and we heard a lot about this throughout the day today. It also includes ensuring that blinding is maintained, for example, when transferring data to study personnel who are supposed to be reviewing blinded data. You should define and document roles, responsibilities, and procedures for access to unblinded information. And you should document any planned and unplanned unblinding that occurred, ensure that the clinical study report accurately reflects any unblinding events that occurred. You should also assess the impact that these unblinding events had on the interpretation of the trial results, and this assessment should also be reflected in your clinical study report. So often what we see is that the sponsors don't consider in their risk assessments the different systems used in the trial and the areas where unblinded data can be accessed and unplanned unblinding can occur. And this case example really illustrates how sponsors can fail to identify where the risks are to unblinding and how these risks can be mitigated. This case was inspired by an actual case, but it's been anonymized, simplified, and changed to illustrate the lessons learned more clearly. So in this case, the pivotal trial to support approval was a multi-center randomized double-blind study. The primary efficacy endpoint was a subjective clinician-reported clinical outcome assessment. Because the study drug caused an adverse event that occurred early in treatment, which could potentially unblind the treatment assignment, the protocol required that each site have blinded independent evaluators to conduct the primary efficacy assessment. These independent evaluators, as I said, were blinded to the treatment assignment. They were also blinded to other patient data, such as lab data and concomitant meds, and adverse event data. And they were not to be involved in any other aspect of the patient's care and disease management. The protocol required an unblinded team to perform certain patient safety assessments during the early treatment phase of the trial. The team completed early dose adverse event monitoring, which could potentially unblind the treatment assignment. And then finally, the protocol required a blinded study team that conducted all other study-related patient care activities. And each team was not supposed to interact with the other team. Each team also had their own database that they were to use to enter their data. And the teams were not supposed to have access to the other team's database. So independent evaluators entered their data in database 1, which contained the primary efficacy endpoint data. The unblinded team entered their data in database 2, which contained the labs and other test results, which if viewed could potentially unblind study personnel to the treatment assignment. And then the blinded team entered their data in database 3, which again contained all other study information. So before we go any further, as an exercise, let's identify the main critical to quality factors related to safeguarding the blind, and specifically during the time that subjects were being enrolled, treated, and assessed in the trial. So first, the critical data is clearly the data that will be used as a basis for approval, so the primary efficacy endpoint data. The lab data and the adverse event data that could unblind study personnel should also be considered as critical data. Procedures that are important to safeguarding the blind in the trial include those related to identifying and assigning roles and responsibilities in the trial, training and communication, because the sponsor and site staff need to understand the protocol design and the importance of their assigned roles and activities in maintaining the integrity of the trial blind. And they also need to understand the potential impact on the trial results if they don't do their job right. Monitoring would also be critical, and it should be tailored to the complexity of the trial and should focus on the critical to quality factors. So which data governance activities do we need to get right to safeguard the blind in this case? And again, for the purpose of this case only, we're going to focus on the time that subjects were being enrolled, treated, and assessed in the trial. So processes and procedures for managing user accounts and system access. So for example, access controls and for assigning and revoking system access, and computerized system training for system users that's commensurate with their roles and responsibilities in the trial. So what were the inspection observations? So I'm sure everyone can predict where I'm going with this, but the bottom line up front is that blinded independent evaluators and blinded study personnel at the majority of the sites were granted access to database 2, the study database that contained unblinding information. So how did this happen? Well, user management processes and procedures were not implemented in a way that was proportionate to the risk to the integrity of the blind. The roles of the independent evaluator, the blinded study team members, and the unblinded team members were not clearly defined at each site so that all involved in this study understood who was doing what. The unblinded and blinded roles changed throughout the trial at many sites, with unblinded team members switching roles midway through the trial to serve as a blinded team member or to be an independent evaluator. To further complicate this, switching of roles, the sponsor didn't ensure that access to the database appropriate for their previous role was revoked. The study monitors completed the database access forms for site staff, and confusion of the roles at the site led to errors on these forms. Also, these forms did not capture enough information about the roles and responsibilities of the site staff. The form just said, for example, give Dr. Smith access to database 1. Because of this, the IT service provider, who was responsible for granting and revoking access, wasn't able to provide a second check to ensure that they were providing the site staff with access to the correct database related to their role in the trial. The IT service provider just did what the form told him to do. So communication and training was an issue because the sponsor and site staff didn't appear to understand the importance of their assigned roles and activities in maintaining the integrity of the blind. So for example, the monitors, again, who were responsible for completing the database access form, weren't properly trained on the study design and the importance of ensuring that study personnel were correctly assigned to the right database. The IT service provider, who assisted in providing access to the databases, also didn't understand the study design. Even if the database access forms completed by the monitors contain sufficient information about site staff's roles, it's unclear if the service provider would have detected errors in the request for the database access because they had no knowledge of the study protocol. Again, they just did what the form told them to do. And then finally, there was no monitoring performed on the critical to quality factors that we've identified as important in safeguarding the blind. No one was proactively monitoring system access to ensure that database access was being granted appropriately. The monitoring plan contained critical errors in the section that described how to complete the database access forms, confusing the database names and who should be giving access to which database. And database access errors were identified by some data managers earlier in the trial conduct, and then access to the wrong database was subsequently revoked for those individuals, but there appeared to be no communication with the sponsor about the incident, and there was no formal investigation into the matter during the trial. So what was the data reliability assessment, and what were the implications to the overall study results? Well, because independent evaluators and blinded study personnel had access to and viewed information in the database that contained unblinding information, we could not rule out the introduction of study bias in the assessments related to the efficacy endpoint. So a sensitivity analysis was conducted, excluding subject data that was impacted by the inappropriate access. So it's hard to summarize all that we've heard today from Shila, Andy, and myself. But our main take-home points, even if you don't remember anything else of what we said, are to identify critical data and processes that, if incorrect, not performed, or performed incorrectly, would threaten the protection of trial participants or the integrity of the study results. You need to ensure input from all trial personnel and study planning, including your data scientists and your key service providers. Focus your resources on the data and data governance activities that are critical to quality. Proactively communicate to all study personnel what data and processes are critical to quality, as this will support understanding of the priorities and resource allocation by the sponsor and investigator site. Ensure relevant training to study personnel that's commensurate with their roles and responsibilities in the trial. And then finally, ensure that monitoring reflects the critical to quality factors. And so with that, I'm going to pass the baton back to Shila.
Thank you to both Cheryl and Andrew for the great presentation.